Another video that I found really frustrating on social democracy was this.
This is Juliana and Marco. They are talking about economic policy. Marco is unhappy. Lots of businesses are making profit, but at the same time, many people are poorly paid or are unemployed.
Well, I'm really not surprised why this happened. You cannot ignore the laws of supply and demand. A good example of this is the immigration crisis, where supply is being outstripped by demand, social security, the welfare state, all the so-called free goodies, such as the free healthcare, the free education, the free prescriptions. Now, I was asked the question, what do you mean by things being taken from another area? Because they just assume that money just takes from that of the private sector, taxpayer, and they just pay that money and that's it. They don't realise that how you pay for so-called free services like that of the NHS or things like the education, etc., it's compensated in other areas of the economy. You pay about 45% tax rate in the United Kingdom, right? That's not enough to make up, the money to pay for all these services, because that 45% tax rate across society has to account for everything. It's all put into one pot and paid for things like healthcare, education and all that. In order for them to find the money to pay for such services, they're going to have to cut back elsewhere in the economy. And that's what it means by the saying, for what government gives to you, it cannot give to you without taking from another first. And I covered in a video, and you can check it out on the social democracy, where I explained a wee bit of the history and I acknowledged the fact that social democrats believe in this mixed economy. So even if we go along with that argument of the mixed economy, first and foremost, the mixed economy cannot escape corporatism. With the laws of supply and demand through government's intervention, it naturally restricts competition. It ends up restricting supply and increasing demand in many regards. Now, government's intervention through the regulation, and this is what social democrats favour, strangling a private sector half to death, and the natural state of strong government regulation is it results in limiting, restricting competition. It also results in monopoly creation, which is another topic, but also it destroys innovation, it restricts the supply, as I say, and increases demand. It basically results in a very restrictive private sector that ends up with a lack of productivity. Through social democracy, it's the fault of this mixed economy, the belief of trying to mix capitalism and socialism together, the natural state of it. You're going to end up with the cartels. You're going to end up with the monopolies. You're going to end up restricting the private sector and increasing private sector costs. The smaller business people, because this is another thing that social democrats support, they support the higher tax rates. You're seeing this with the Scottish National Party, and I actually have an article to show just look what they're doing to the employment in Scotland. Now, they're going to try and blame that on Brexit. Economics is a study of trade-offs. The saying goes, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. In other words, you cannot have your higher tax rates and your lower costs of living at the same time. You cannot have your so-called free education, your free healthcare, your free prescriptions, and then have, a more affordable cost of living or have a high employment level at the same time, because the bottom line is, there are trade-offs. That's why you end up facing college and university placement reduction, where there's a shortage of placements available. Have your free NHS or your free education. You end up seeing teachers being paid off. In other words, they lose their job. A reduction in employment. It could be a reduction in working hours. So more part-time work, less full-time work. It could mean wage suppression. It could mean many things, higher inflation, such as the higher costs of your gas and electricity prices. Let's just move on with the next part of his argument.
Marco thinks that the economy should grow, but shouldn't that also be possible with better jobs? can't the state do anything to help? Juliana explains that the relationship between the state and the market economy has already caused many notable thinkers to rack their brains for a solution. In the mid-18th century, Adam Smith believed that the state, or the king as it was back then, and the market should be strictly separated. The invisible hand of the market would best provide for everyone.
And Adam Smith was absolutely right. Anytime and anywhere you saw the government's intervention in the economy, you would see catastrophic failure, with all of the government subsidies that resulted in bankruptcy after bankruptcy after bankruptcy, whether it was the hundreds of companies in the railroad industry or the hundreds of, private companies that you would see in that of the steamship industry. They all went bankrupt because of the government subsidies. Hong Kong proved it. Singapore proved it. Anywhere that you find economic freedom, you will see the best performing, most efficient economies.
During the industrialization of the 19th century, Karl Marx saw firsthand the wretched conditions of the working class. Since the market economy was clearly not able to provide these people with the prosperity they anticipated, he was in favour of abolishing it completely.
This is the argument that frustrates me the most, and it's the one on the Industrial Revolution, and I could go into a lengthy argument on that. But the way they picture it, the Shire out of the Lord of the Rings before the Industrial Revolution, where they're all happy, and then all of a sudden, along comes the factory, somebody puts a ring on, life was just simply awful. There was a collapse of living standards and a big cloud of darkness comes over the top of them. That's honestly how they view the Industrial Revolution. Even if you were to look at statistics, between 1650 to 1700, you will find that the people were worse off. And then if you were to contrast that to 1850, you would see that the people were actually better off. The whole thing about the Industrial Revolution was, in Britain, they said there was a collapse of living standards in the first Industrial Revolution, therefore government had to come to the saviour. Well, there wasn't. Whilst speaking about that of the poor working conditions of the Industrial Revolution, it's not looking at what life was like before then. It doesn't take into account that in the 1780s, they would work more than 80 hours per week. Yet by the 1840s, they would have dramatically decreased the amount of working hours. There is no denying the fact that the living conditions and the working conditions were awful. But if you were to contrast the working conditions and the living conditions, believe it or not, that was actually a big improvement to where they came from 50 years before that period. The workplace continuously grew safer. The working hours were continuously reducing. Life expectancy was continuously increasing. The population of Great Britain had more than tripled.
In the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes proposed a solution. The market can provide prosperity if the state establishes the right framework. In the event of crises and problems, the state must intervene. A coordinated market economy.
I'm not going to go into too much detail on the problem with Keynesianism because I have provided the argument and you can go and check the video out. It was actually Keynesian policies of printing, borrowing and spending that resulted in exacerbating the problem of the Great Depression, and those policies you would end up seeing under FDR ended up creating an even greater problem. It prolonged the Great Depression. For what was meant to be a temporary measure, they ended up using it during periods where the economy was doing better off. And this is precisely what's resulted in this reckless economy with soaring debt crisis and, of course, a deficit problem that's out of control, where they seem to think that it constitutes as being wealthy and rich by spending money you don't have.
This is also the idea behind the economic policy of social democracy. Marco wants to find out more about the economic policy of social democracy. Juliana explains to him that the economic policy of social democracy is built upon three principles: growth, social balance, and sustainability.
Well, one thing we can most certainly say is that it really has not been sustainable. It was precisely what resulted in the recession leading into the 1980s. All that reckless borrowing and spending that resulted in that problem in Great Britain. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they then crippled our economy and resulted in that of a banking crisis through all the continual bailouts, where QE1, QE2 failed, and even afterwards, QE3 had failed. It's like Nicola Sturgeon's economic, policy of, oh, we've got a deficit here, and we've got a debt problem here. So what will we do? We'll increase the tax rates and restrict the productive output, which is what happens. This is me speaking about what actually happens. We'll increase the tax rates, which ends up, resulting in lower levels of productivity. And then after doing so, we'll then, attempt to, finance the economy by increasing printing, borrowing and spending. We'll spend more, and somehow that will result in reducing the debt problem. That's the very reason why creditors were threatening to pull out of Scotland through the Scottish independence, because they feared where Scotland was going, because she is reckless. The SNP are just reckless. They're clueless. They don't even know the first thing about economics. I mean, who in the right mind thinks you reduce debt by trying to spend your way out of a problem? That's what increases debt. If your expenditure is higher than your income, then it's a bit obvious where you're going to end up. All of the legally protected fraud that you could also take into it, again correlating to the government subsidies that results in inefficiency in the private sector. That's another problem with their Keynesian economics.